The flea market was a labyrinth of curiosities, each stall brimming with relics from lives long past. Daniel Hayes wandered through the winding aisles, his fingers brushing lightly over the worn surfaces of forgotten treasures. It was a Saturday evening, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the cluttered space. This place, with its dusty trinkets and the faint scent of old leather and wood, had always been a retreat for him, a place to lose himself, if only for a little while. Daniel had no particular goal in mind as he meandered through the stalls. He rarely bought anything, content instead to admire the oddities and imagine the stories behind them. But as he rounded a corner, something peculiar caught his eye. A mask perched on a velvet-lined shelf amid a sea of tarnished silverware and faded books. It wasn't the kind of mask one would expect to find in a flea market. It was an intricate piece with ornate carvings that spiraled across its surface in a mesmerizing pattern. The material looked like aged ivory, though it had a strange sheen that seemed to shift in the light. Its hollow eyes were deep and unsettling, and as Daniel stepped closer, he could have sworn they were watching him. He couldn't help but reach out, his fingers hovering just above the mask's surface, as if drawn by some invisible force. There was something about it that made his skin prickle, a feeling both of unease and fascination. The mask was beautiful, but in a way that made him want to look away, as if staring at it for too long would reveal something he wasn't ready to see. "You have a good eye," a voice rasped behind him, breaking the spell. Daniel turned to see an elderly man standing there, his face weathered and craggy, like old stone. The vendor's eyes were sharp, though, and they flicked between Daniel and the mask with a knowing look. "Where did you find this?" Daniel asked, trying to sound casual, though his voice betrayed his curiosity. "Estate sale, up north." The collector was a strange one, had all sorts of oddities. This mask, though, it was the crown jewel of his collection. No one else seemed interested in it, though. "Too unsettling," they said. The man chuckled dryly, as if sharing an inside joke. Daniel hesitated, his gaze returning to the mask. There was something almost hypnotic about it, the way the carvings seemed to pulse, as though alive. Despite the unease twisting in his gut, he found himself asking, "How much? For you?" "Let's say 50, the vendor replied, a sly grin tugging at his lips. $50 was steep for something Daniel would normally consider a mere decoration, but he didn't argue. He handed over the cash, and the vendor carefully wrapped the mask in brown paper before placing it into a worn leather bag. As Daniel took the bag, the vendor's hand lingered for a moment, his eyes locking with Daniel's. "Be careful with that," the old man said, his tone suddenly serious. "It's more than just a pretty face." Daniel nodded, though he didn't really understand what the man meant. He left the flea market with the mask tucked under his arm, the vendor's words echoing in his mind. As he walked home, the evening air cooled around him, but the unease he felt lingered, pressing at the edges of his thoughts. His apartment was a small, modest space in a quiet part of town, the kind of place where nothing much happened, where life was predictable and safe. As soon as he entered, he placed the mask on the mantel, its new home amid a collection of framed photos and knickknacks. But the mask stood out, its presence almost demanding attention. Later that night, after dinner, Daniel found himself drawn to it again. The room was dark, the only light coming from a single lamp in the corner, casting long shadows that seemed to dance around the mask. He sat on the edge of his couch, staring at it, unable to shake the feeling that it was staring back. "What is it about you?" he muttered to himself, the words barely audible in the stillness of the room. Before he realized what he was doing, Daniel reached out, lifting the mask from its place. It was lighter than he expected, almost as if it were hollow, but the weight of it in his hands felt strangely significant. His fingers traced the carvings, the grooves and ridges cold under his touch. Then, almost without thinking, he brought the mask up to his face. The instant it touched his skin, a chill shot through him, like a current of icy water. His breath hitched, and for a split second, he thought of pulling it away. But something stopped him. The mask felt as though it had been made for him, the contours fitting perfectly, like a second skin. He walked to the bathroom, the mask still on his face, a strange compulsion guiding his steps. When he flipped the light switch, the sudden brightness made him squint. He looked into the mirror, expecting to see his own familiar face beneath the mask. What he saw instead made his blood run cold. The reflection staring back at him was not his own. The face was twisted, the features grotesque and warped, with a grin that stretched too wide across lips that weren't his. The eyes were wild, gleaming with a malevolent intelligence, as if the mask had taken on a life of its own. Panic seized him. He reached up, his fingers scrabbling at the edges of the mask, trying to pull it off. But it wouldn't budge. It was as if the mask had fused with his skin, becoming a part of him. He tugged harder, his breath coming in short, frantic gasps, but the mask remained firmly in place. Terror clawed at his throat as he stared at the mirror, the grinning face in the reflection seeming to mock his efforts. The eyes of the mask, no, his eyes, gleamed with a dark satisfaction, as though they knew something he didn't. Daniel stumbled back, away from the mirror, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned off the light, plunging the room into darkness, but the image of that twisted grin was burned into his mind. He felt it even now, stretching his lips in a way that felt foreign, wrong. He collapsed onto his bed, the mask still clinging to his face, the horror of what had just happened settling in. The room was silent, save for the sound of his own ragged breathing. As he lay there, a whispering voice began to echo in his mind, so soft he could barely make out the words. But one thing was clear. Whatever this mask was, it had no intention of letting him go. Daniel awoke the next morning, the early light filtering through the curtains, casting a pale glow over his bedroom. For a moment he lay there, disoriented, trying to convince himself that the events of the previous night had been nothing more than a nightmare. But the weight on his face, the unnatural tightness around his skin, quickly shattered that illusion. He sat up slowly, dread curling in his stomach as he forced himself to look in the mirror across the room. His breath caught in his throat at the sight. The mask was still there, its twisted grin as grotesque as ever. It had become a part of him, the carvings now etched into his skin, as if they had always been there. The eyes, once hollow, now gleamed with a life of their own, and Daniel knew they were not his own. He tried to pull it off again, his fingers scrabbling desperately at the edges, but the mask held fast, as if it had grown roots deep into his flesh. A wave of panic surged through him, but there was nothing he could do. Exhausted, he slumped back on the bed, his mind racing to find some explanation, some way out of this nightmare. The voice began to whisper again, faint and distant, like the murmur of a crowd far away. At first, the words were indistinct, a meaningless jumble that buzzed in the back of his mind. But as the hours passed, they became clearer, more insistent, echoing with a sinister intent that made his skin crawl. "Why resist?" it asked, the tone smooth, almost soothing, if not for the undercurrent of malice. "You know what you want, what you've always wanted. Let go, Daniel. Let me in." He recoiled at the voice, shaking his head violently as if he could dislodge it. But the more he resisted, the stronger it became, pressing into his thoughts, filling his mind with dark urges that frightened him. As the days wore on, Daniel began to notice subtle changes in his behavior. At first, it was little things: impatience where he once had been calm, irritability replacing his usual easygoing nature. But soon, the changes became more pronounced, more alarming. He found himself snapping at colleagues over trivial matters, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation. He could see the shock in their eyes, the way they looked at him as if he were a stranger. And in a way, he was. The mask seemed to tighten whenever he tried to push the voice away, constricting his face like a vice until he relented. Each time he gave in, the voice would praise him, a sickly sweet tone that made his skin crawl, but which also brought a strange sense of relief, as if by surrendering he could find some small peace. It wasn't long before his friends began to notice as well. His best friend, Mark, invited him out for drinks one evening, hoping to catch up after weeks of Daniel's uncharacteristic silence. They met at their usual spot, a cozy bar tucked away in a quiet part of town. But as soon as Daniel walked in, Mark knew something was wrong. "Dan, you look different," Mark said cautiously, his brow furrowed with concern as he studied Daniel's face. Daniel forced a smile, but it felt wrong, like his face wasn't his own. The mask's grin stretched his lips into a grotesque parody of happiness. "I've just been busy, that's all. Work's been crazy." Mark nodded slowly, though his eyes remained wary. As they talked, Daniel felt the voice nudging at the edges of his mind, urging him to lash out, to say something cruel. It whispered venomous thoughts, twisting his perception of the world around him. "He's judging you," the voice hissed. "He thinks you're weak. Pathetic." Daniel's hands clenched around his glass, his knuckles white. He tried to ignore the voice, to focus on the conversation, but the mask seemed to tighten, a sharp pain shooting through his temples. The urge to give in was overwhelming. "Dan," Mark's voice cut through the haze, pulling him back. He looked up to find his friend staring at him with genuine worry. "Are you okay? You seem different, distant." For a moment, Daniel wanted to confide in him, to tell him everything. But the voice surged, filling his mind with a dark, bitter anger. "He doesn't care about you," the voice snarled. "He just wants to control you, keep you in your place. Show him who you really are." The words spilled out before he could stop them. "What's it to you, Mark?" he snapped, his tone sharper than intended. "Why do you care? Maybe I'm tired of being the same old Daniel, the guy everyone relies on but no one really sees." Mark blinked in surprise, taken aback by the sudden outburst. "I didn't mean anything by it, Dan. I'm just worried about you, that's all." The mask's grip tightened, and Daniel felt a cruel satisfaction bubbling up inside him. "Worried? Or just nosy? Maybe you should worry about your own life instead of meddling in mine." The hurt in Mark's eyes was instant, and for a fleeting second, Daniel felt a pang of regret. But it was quickly swallowed by the dark satisfaction the voice offered, a twisted reward for giving in to the anger. Mark set his glass down slowly, his expression hardening. "If that's how you feel, maybe we should call it a night. I'm not sure who you are right now, but you're not the Dan I know." He stood up, his eyes lingering on Daniel for a moment longer, as if searching for some trace of his old friend. Then, with a shake of his head, Mark turned and walked out, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts and the voice. As the door closed behind Mark, the mask seemed to loosen slightly, the pressure on his face easing. The voice purred in his mind, pleased with his actions. "See? You're stronger than they think. You don't need them." But as Daniel sat there, nursing his drink in the empty bar, a deep loneliness began to creep in, filling the void left by Mark's departure. He knew the mask was changing him, warping his thoughts, his emotions. Yet, despite everything, a part of him was beginning to enjoy the power it gave him, the way it allowed him to say and do things he never would have dared before. The days that followed were a blur of escalating conflict. Daniel found himself pushing away anyone who tried to get close, lashing out with cruel words and cold indifference. Each time, the mask tightened its grip, reinforcing the dark thoughts that were now a constant presence in his mind. He began to isolate himself, avoiding his friends and family, afraid of what he might say or do in their presence. The voice had become his only companion, guiding his actions, twisting his thoughts until he could no longer distinguish between his own desires and those the mask planted in his mind. At work, his colleagues gave him a wide berth, their once friendly interactions now strained and awkward. The whispering among them grew louder, and Daniel could feel their eyes on him, their silent judgment. But instead of feeling ashamed, he felt a simmering rage, an anger that bubbled just beneath the surface, waiting for an excuse to erupt. One afternoon, after a particularly frustrating meeting, Daniel found himself alone in his office, the mask's voice gnawing at his mind. He stared at the reflection in the window, the grinning face looking back at him with a malevolence that sent a shiver down his spine. "They don't respect you," the voice sneered. "You're better than them, stronger. Show them." Without thinking, Daniel grabbed a glass paperweight from his desk and hurled it at the wall. The glass shattered, the sound sharp and jarring in the small space. He watched the shards scatter across the floor, feeling a twisted satisfaction at the destruction. But as the adrenaline faded, he was left with the stark reality of what he had done. He had become someone else, someone he didn't recognize, a man driven by anger, consumed by the mask's influence. Daniel knew he was losing himself, but the more he tried to fight it, the tighter the mask seemed to cling. The voice had become his constant companion, feeding on his fears, his insecurities, and turning them into weapons. And the worst part was that he was starting to believe it, to accept that this new version of himself, this dark, twisted persona, was who he was meant to be. As he stood there, breathing heavily in the silence of his office, Daniel realized with a sinking feeling that there was no one left to turn to. He had pushed everyone away, and now he was truly alone, with nothing but the mask and the voice that had taken over his life. The descent into darkness was a gradual, almost imperceptible slide. Daniel no longer recognized the man who stared back at him. From the mirrors he avoided more and more each day. The mask, once a foreign object clinging to his face, had become an inseparable part of him. Its grinning visage was no longer a separate entity. It was his face now, a twisted, macabre reflection of the man he had once been. Each morning, as he stumbled out of bed, the world around him seemed more distant, more surreal. The city's familiar sounds, cars honking, people chatting on the streets, the distant hum of life, began to fade into the background, replaced by the incessant whispering in his mind. The voice, which had once been an unsettling presence, now dominated his thoughts, guiding his actions with a chilling certainty. "Why pretend anymore, Daniel?" it would ask, its tone both soothing and menacing. "You know what you want. You've always known." He stopped resisting. It was easier that way. The struggle only brought more pain, more tightening of the mask, more searing headaches that left him doubled over in agony. When he let go, when he gave in to the voice, the mask seemed to relax, almost as if it were rewarding him for his compliance. The transformation was complete when Daniel no longer felt the need to hold back. The rage that had simmered beneath the surface for so long was now a constant, burning presence. He started to lash out indiscriminately, his actions becoming more erratic, more violent. At work, he became known as the man to avoid, a powder keg ready to explode at the slightest provocation. It started small, a shove here, a harsh word there. But soon the voice demanded more. It craved chaos, thrived on the fear it could instill in others. Daniel found himself wandering the city at night, drawn to its darker corners, where the boundaries of society blurred and the rules no longer applied. The seedy underbelly of the city became his playground, a place where he could unleash the growing darkness within him without restraint. One evening, he found himself in a dingy alley behind a rundown bar, the air thick with the stench of alcohol and desperation. A man, unsteady on his feet and reeking of booze, bumped into him as he passed. Daniel's temper flared instantly, the mask's grin stretching wider as the voice urged him on. "Teach him a lesson," it whispered, its tone dripping with malice. "Show him who's in control." Without thinking, Daniel grabbed the man by the collar, slamming him against the brick wall. The man's eyes widened in fear, his drunken haze quickly replaced by the stark realization of danger. But Daniel didn't care. The fear in the man's eyes only fueled the fire burning inside him. "What the hell, man?" the drunk slurred, trying to pull away, but Daniel's grip was ironclad. The voice roared in his mind, demanding more, pushing him further. "You think you can just walk all over me?" Daniel snarled, his voice barely recognizable, a guttural sound that sent chills down his own spine. "You think you can do whatever you want?" the man whimpered, his feeble attempts to break free only increasing Daniel's rage. He pulled his fist back, ready to strike, when a flicker of something, remorse, sanity, a vestige of the man he once was, made him hesitate. But the voice was relentless, pounding against his skull, erasing any trace of hesitation. "Do it!" Daniel's fist connected with the man's jaw with a sickening crunch, the force of the blow sending him sprawling to the ground. Blood spattered the alleyway and the man groaned in pain, curling into a ball as if trying to protect himself from the onslaught he knew was coming. For a moment, Daniel stood over him, breathing heavily, the adrenaline surging through his veins like a drug. The mask's grin seemed to spread across his entire face, a grotesque expression of satisfaction. The voice purred in his mind, pleased with his obedience. "This is who you are now. Embrace it." But as the man on the ground whimpered in pain, a cold wave of horror washed over Daniel. What had he become? This wasn't the man who had once cared deeply for others, who had gone out of his way to help a friend in need. That man was gone, buried beneath layers of anger and violence, replaced by a monster wearing a mask that could never be removed. He staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the reality of what he had done set in. The voice tried to soothe him, to assure him that this was just the beginning, that there was so much more he could do, so much more power he could seize. But Daniel was no longer sure he wanted it. He stumbled out of the alley, leaving the man crumpled on the ground, the mask's grin still plastered across his face. The night air was cool against his skin, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside him. His thoughts were a chaotic swirl of fear, guilt, and the growing realization that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. As he wandered the empty streets, the city's lights flickering around him, Daniel felt the weight of the mask pressing down on him, heavier than ever before. It was no longer just an object. It was a part of him, a constant reminder of the darkness he had allowed to consume him. He had become a stranger to himself, lost in a maze of his own making, with no way out. Days bled into nights, and Daniel's descent continued. The voice in his head grew stronger, louder, its demands more insistent. The mask tightened its grip, its influence spreading like a poison through his veins. The man who had once been Daniel Hayes was now just a shadow, buried deep beneath the layers of anger, violence, and the mask's twisted control. His interactions with others became increasingly erratic. At work, his colleagues avoided him altogether, their once friendly greetings replaced by nervous glances and hurried exits whenever he approached. Daniel could feel their fear, and while a part of him recoiled at the thought of what he had become, another part, one controlled by the mask, reveled in it. His nights were spent in the darkest parts of the city, where the lines between right and wrong blurred, and the voice could have free rein over his actions. He became known in those circles, a figure of fear and respect, someone who was not to be crossed. But there was no satisfaction in it, no sense of accomplishment, only a hollow emptiness that grew with each passing day. One night, as he stood on a rooftop overlooking the city, the cool wind whipping through his hair, Daniel felt the weight of everything he had lost pressing down on him. The mask's grin was still there, still as grotesque and mocking as ever. But for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt a flicker of something else, regret. The voice, sensing his hesitation, tried to drown it out, whispering dark promises and threats, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he had reached the end of the road. He had let the mask take everything from him, his friends, his family, his humanity. And now, standing alone on the edge of the rooftop, he wondered if there was anything left worth saving. The city stretched out below him, a sea of lights and shadows, indifferent to the turmoil raging inside him. Daniel stared down at it, his thoughts churning, the voice still hissing in his ear. But he knew, deep down, that the mask's promises were empty, that the power it offered was a lie, a trap that had ensnared him and would never let him go. As he stood there, teetering on the edge, a sudden realization hit him. There was only one way to escape the mask's grip, only one way to reclaim what little of himself was left. It was a desperate, terrifying thought, but in that moment it felt like the only choice he had left. With a deep breath, Daniel turned away from the edge and walked back into the shadows, the voice still whispering, the mask still grinning. But now there was a new resolve in his step, a determination to end the nightmare once and for all, no matter the cost. He knew what he had to do. The descent had brought him to the brink, but it was time to take control, to face the darkness head on, and to break free from the mask's hold, even if it meant destroying everything in the process. The nights had grown longer, darker, as if the world itself had turned against Daniel Hayes. Each hour felt like an eternity, each minute dragging him deeper into the abyss he had tried so desperately to escape. The mask, once an object of fascination, had become a prison, and its grip on his soul was tightening with every passing second. He sat alone in his apartment, the remnants of his shattered life scattered around him. The photos on the walls, images of a life he barely remembered, seemed to mock him now. They were relics of a man who no longer existed, a man who had been consumed by the darkness he had unwittingly invited into his life. The mirror in his bedroom loomed before him, cracked and splintered from the countless times he had tried to shatter the image that stared back at him. The face in the reflection was no longer his own. It was the mask's, with its grotesque grin and malevolent eyes. It taunted him, daring him to look away, but he couldn't. He was transfixed, caught in the web of his own creation. The voice in his head was louder than ever, a cacophony of whispers and shouts, urging him to give in, to accept the fate that had been sealed the moment he had put the mask on. It promised him power, control, freedom from the pain that had become his constant companion. But Daniel knew better now. He knew that the voice lied, that the mask was nothing but a parasite, feeding on his fear, his anger, his despair. He had pushed everyone away, his friends, his family, even the fleeting connections he had made in the dark alleys and forgotten corners of the city. There was no one left to save him, no one who even knew the true horror of what he had become. He was utterly, completely alone. Except for the mask. He stood slowly, his legs trembling beneath him as if they could barely support the weight of his own body. The mirror's reflection followed his every move, the grin widening as he approached. His hand clenched around the hammer he had retrieved from the toolbox, the metal cold and reassuring in his grip. The mask had taken everything from him, and now, in these final moments, it was time to take something back. Daniel raised the hammer, the muscles in his arm taut, trembling with the effort. The mask seemed to pulse in response, tightening its hold on his face, digging into his skin with a pain that was almost unbearable. The voice screamed in his mind, a torrent of rage and terror. But Daniel didn't falter. This was his last chance, his only chance to end this nightmare. The hammer came down with a force that shook the entire room, the impact reverberating through his bones. The mirror shattered instantly, shards of glass exploding outward in a shower of silver, the sound like a gunshot in the silence of the night. For a brief, glorious moment, the mask cracked as well, the surface splintering under the blow. But the victory was short-lived. As the glass rained down around him, Daniel's heart sank. The reflection in the mirror, fragmented and distorted by the broken shards, still grinned back at him, unchanged, unwavering. The mask had shattered, but the twisted, grotesque face remained, as if it had become a permanent part of him, etched into his very soul. A scream tore from his throat, a raw, anguished sound that echoed off the walls of the empty apartment. He dropped the hammer, his hands flying to his face, desperately clawing at the remnants of the mask, trying to rip it away. But it was no use. The mask was gone. But the grin, the malevolent eyes, they were his now. They had always been his. Staggering back, Daniel collapsed to the floor, his body racked with sobs. The voice was silent now, its purpose fulfilled. It had taken everything from him, his life, his identity, his very humanity, and left him with nothing but the hollow shell of a man whose face was no longer his own. As he lay there, the darkness closing in around him, Daniel felt a cold, eerie calm settle over him. He was free, in a way, free from the mask, from the voice, from the endless torment. But the price of that freedom was a permanent reminder of the darkness he had allowed to consume him. The shattered mirror reflected 1,000 versions of his face, each one grinning back at him with that same twisted smile. It was a face he would never escape, a face that would haunt him for the rest of his days. But as he stared into those fractured reflections, a single, final thought took hold in his mind. Perhaps this was who he had been all along. Perhaps the mask had only revealed the truth, peeling away the layers of civility and decency to expose the darkness lurking beneath. And now, with nothing left to hide behind, Daniel Hayes was finally, irrevocably, himself. The thought brought no comfort, no relief, only a cold, unrelenting certainty that there was no going back. The man who had once been Daniel Hayes was gone, and in his place was something else, something darker, something that grinned at the world with a twisted sense of satisfaction. As the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the curtains, Daniel rose to his feet, his new face reflecting in the shattered glass at his feet. The mask was gone, but its legacy lived on, carved into the flesh and bone of the man who had once been human. And as he walked away from the mirror, from the remnants of his old life, he knew that the world would never be the same, for he had become something more and something less than a man. He had become the mask